What would you do if a 10-year-old boy with duct-taped boots promised you the one thing every doctor couldn't, that he could make your paralyzed daughter walk again? The air was cold that morning in Lansing, Michigan. Not the kind of cold that brings a gentle snow, but sharp, wet cold that seeped right through your coat and made you feel it deep in your bones. You could see your breath cloud in front of your face, and if you didn't have gloves, your fingertips would sting and turn red. Outside the Children's Medical Center, people moved quickly. They rushed in and out of the big glass doors, bundled up in scarves, clutching warm coffee cups tight. They walked fast, as if by moving quickly enough, they could somehow escape the reason they had to be there in the first place. It was a place where worries hung heavy in the air, mixed with the smell of antiseptic and hope. But one person wasn't rushing. He sat on a flattened cardboard box near the revolving doors, perfectly still. A boy. His name was Leonard, but everyone called him Leo. Leo Cruz. He was just 10 years old. His coat was a size too big. The sleeves rolled up so many times it looked like thick cloth bracelets around his thin wrists. One of his boots had a strip of silver duct tape across the toe. A blue knit beanie was pulled down low on his forehead, almost covering his eyebrows. He didn't beg. He didn't look at people passing by. He just sat there, a weathered notebook open on his lap, a pencil moving quietly across the page. He was drawing. He was there most Saturdays. At first, some of the hospital staff had tried to shoo him away, worried about a boy alone on the steps. But after a while, they'd given up. Leo didn't cause any trouble. He smiled if you said hello, and when he wasn't sketching, he was watching, always watching. Most people figured he had a parent or sibling inside. Maybe he was just waiting for a ride. In a place like that, everyone has their own private storm to weather, so nobody asked too many questions. Across the street, a dark gray Range Rover was parked by a fire hydrant. The engine was running, a soft puff of exhaust mixing with the cold air, but the car didn't move. Inside sat David Miller, a man in his late 40s, with sharp jawline that was starting to soften and hair that was turning a distinguished gray at the temples. His tie was loose, his expensive coat wrinkled. You could see the money in the car and the watch on his wrist, but you could also see the exhaustion. He looked like a man who was running on empty. In the back seat, tucked into a booster seat, was his daughter, Sophie. She was 6 years old, with a head of soft brown curls. A pink blanket was wrapped around her legs, but her eyes, wide and serious, were fixed on the hospital building. They held a stillness that didn't belong to a 6-year-old. An accident had changed everything. One moment, she was a whirlwind, climbing trees and laughing. The next, she was silent. Her world shrunk to the size of a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down. David took a deep breath, turned off the engine, and got out. He opened the back door and leaned in. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft. Sophie didn't answer. She just lifted her arms. He scooped her up carefully, as if she were made of the most delicate glass, and carried her toward the hospital entrance. He was so focused on her, on shielding her from the cold and the sad reality of this place, that he didn't even see the boy on the cardboard box. But the boy saw him. Leo watched. He saw the way the man held the girl, like she was the most precious thing in the world and also the most fragile. He saw the way the girl's eyes looked past everything, up at the gray sky, avoiding the doors that led to more needles and tests and quiet voices saying, "We'll just have to wait and see." Leo watched them get closer, and then, just as David was about to step through the revolving door, Leo stood up. He closed his notebook and tucked it under his arm. "Sir," he called out. His voice was clear, cutting through the cold air. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. David stopped. He turned, his brow furrowed. He hadn't noticed a boy before. "Yeah." Leo took a small step forward. He looked David right in the eye, and then at Sophie. He said the words simply, without a hint of drama or doubt. It was a statement of fact. "I can make your daughter walk again." David froze. It wasn't the words themselves that stopped him. It was the way they were said. This wasn't a plea for money. It wasn't a joke. It was spoken with a quiet, unshakable certainty that felt ancient, especially coming from a child so young. He tightened his grip around Sophie. "What did you just say to me?" David's voice was low, a warning. Leo didn't flinch. He took another step. I said, I can help her walk again. David's eyes narrowed. He looked Leo up and down, the too big coat, the taped-up boot, the faint smudges on his cheeks. A surge of anger, mixed with strange, unwelcome pang of pity, rose in his chest. That's not a funny thing to say, kid. I'm not joking, Leo replied. His voice was still soft, but there was a strength in it, a grown-up kind of stillness in a 10-year-old's body. David shook his head, his jaw tight. He looked at this boy, this stranger, and then down at his daughter, who had been through so much. This felt like a cruel trick. He turned away. Just stay away from us, he muttered, and he pushed through the revolving doors into the warm, bright lobby. But as he walked down the long, sterile hallway, Leo's words followed him. They echoed in his head, drowning out the sound of his own footsteps. I can make your daughter walk again. They were ridiculous. Impossible. Yet the boy's tone, so calm, so sure, had gotten under his skin. It was like a seed had been planted, and try as he might, David couldn't dig it out. For the next few hours, he sat in examination rooms. He listened to the doctors and therapists. They used the same phrases they always did. Managing expectations, a long road ahead, were encouraged by small signs of nerve response. They were kind, professional, but their words were filled with caution. They were building a wall of reality, brick by careful brick. And all the while, David heard that boy's voice, a whisper against that wall. I can help her walk again. By early afternoon, they were done. The sun had broken through the clouds, but it was a liar. The air was still bitingly cold. David carried Sophie back toward the parking lot, her head resting on his shoulder. He was almost to the Range Rover when he saw him. Leo, still there, sitting on the same cardboard box. But this time he wasn't drawing. He was just sitting, and he was looking right at David. Not in a challenging way, but as if he'd been waiting, as if he'd known David would have to come back this way. David hesitated. He looked down at Sophie. Her eyes closed now. He felt a confusing mix of emotions, anger, exhaustion, and that stubborn, dangerous little seed of hope. He walked over to the car, settled Sophie gently into her seat, and buckled her in. Then he turned and strode toward the boy. You, David said, his voice tight. Why would you say something like that to me? Do you have any idea what we're going through? Leo stood up. He met David's angry gaze without blinking. You don't have to know someone to help them. You're a child. David snapped, gesturing at Leo's clothes. You're sitting out here with tape on your shoes. What could you possibly know about any of this? Leo looked down for a moment, his fingers tracing the spiral binding of his notebook. When he looked up, his eyes were different, a little sadder. My mom, she used to help people walk again, he said quietly. She was a physical therapist. She taught me things. She said the body remembers how to move, even when it forgets for a little while. David stared at him, the skepticism a hard knot in his stomach. So what? You watched your mom do some exercises, and now you think you're a doctor? I watched her help a man walk after he was in a chair for 5 years, Leo said, his voice gaining a little strength. She didn't have fancy machines, just her hands, and her patience, and faith. David opened his mouth to argue, but then he stopped. He glanced around. A nurse walking to her car gave Leo a small, familiar wave. A janitor pushing a trash cart nodded in the boy's direction. They knew him. This kid was a fixture here. I'm not giving you any money, David said flatly. I didn't ask for any, Leo replied. Then what do you want? Leo took a deep breath, the cold air making a small cloud around his face. Just 1 hour. Let me show you. David looked back at the car. Sophie had woken up and was watching them through the window, her expression curious. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. This was crazy. He should get in the car and drive away and never think about this boy again. Fine, David heard himself say, the word surprising him. You want to waste your time? Meet us at Willow Creek Park. Tomorrow, noon. Don't be late. It felt less like an invitation and more like a test. Leo nodded just once. I'll be there. David got into his SUV, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. But as he drove off, he glanced in the rear-view mirror. Leo was still standing there, hands at his sides, watching them go. His face was unreadable. That evening, after dinner, David sat in his home office. Papers were spread across his desk. Insurance forms, medical reports. None of it made sense. All he could see was the boy's steady gaze. A soft sound made him turn. Sophie was in the doorway, peering in. "Yeah, baby," he said. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. "Who was that boy?" David paused. "Just somebody we met outside the hospital." Sophie was quiet for a moment, her head tilted. "He looked like he believed it," she said. "Believe what, sweetie?" "That I could walk." David stared at her, his lips parting slightly. She gave a tiny, almost shy smile and walked her fingers across the armrest of her wheelchair. But David wasn't smiling, because for the first time in a very, very long time, something deep inside him, something he thought had gone numb forever, didn't feel numb anymore. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. Willow Creek Park was the kind of place that had seen better days. The basketball court had a long crack running through the key, the swings growing on their rusty chains, and the grass was patchy and worn. On Sundays, it was usually quiet, a place for passing through, not for staying. But that Sunday at noon, it felt different. Leo was already there. He sat on a wooden bench scarred with initials and old gum, the one closest to a big bare oak tree. He wore the same oversized jacket, but his notebook was tucked away in a small, worn gym bag at his feet. Next to the bag was a neatly folded towel. He sat perfectly still, watching the road. Right at noon, David's gray Range Rover pulled up. The engine cut, and the silence of the park settled back in. David got out, his movement slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word as he opened the back door, lifted Sophie out, and settled her gently into her wheelchair. His face was a mask of guarded skepticism. He was here, but every line of his body said he was ready for this to be a failure, to have his initial instincts proven right. He wheeled Sophie over to the bench. Leo stood up. "Hi," he said, his voice polite calm. David gave a stiff nod. Sophie offered a shy little wave. "Hi, Sophie," Leo said, a small smile touching his lips. Her eyes widened just a bit. "Hi." David's head snapped up. "How do you know her name?" "You said it yesterday," Leo replied simply. "When you were buckling her in. I remember stuff." David didn't respond, just gestured vaguely at the folded towel. "So, what's the plan? Magic trick?" Leo ignored the sarcasm. He knelt down, unzipped his gym bag. He pulled out a pair of thick socks, a new-looking tennis ball, a small jar of cocoa butter, and a plastic container. He opened it to reveal a cloth-wrapped bundle. When he unfolded it, it was filled with warm rice, steaming slightly in the cold air. David squinted. "What is all that?" "Stuff my mom used," Leo answered, his focus on arranging the items. "The rice holds heat, helps loosen muscles that are tight from not moving. The ball is for pressure points." David folded his arms, a fortress of doubt, but he watched as Leo turned to Sophie. "Is it okay if I work with your legs for a little bit?" Leo asked her. His tone was respectful, giving her a choice. "I promise nothing will hurt. And if anything feels weird, you just say stop, and I'll stop right away." "Okay." Sophie looked up at her father. He sighed, a sound of surrender to this bizarre situation. "You can try. Just be careful." Leo nodded. He knelt on the towel beside her wheelchair. Gently, he moved the blanket from her lap and placed a warm rice pack over her thighs. Sophie flinched at first, a tiny jerk. "Too hot?" Leo asked immediately. She shook her head, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "No, it feels good." Leo gave a small, satisfied nod and waited, letting the heat seep in. After a few minutes, he began to move her legs. He wasn't yanking or forcing. His hands were surprisingly sure as he guided her limbs through small, gentle rotations, ankle circles, bending and straightening her knee. It was a quiet, rhythmic ritual. "You ever actually done this before?" David asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Leo didn't look up from his work. "My mom used to take me to shelters after school. She helped veterans, people who couldn't afford therapy. She said everybody deserves to feel human again. I used to carry her bag." David's stern expression flickered. And she taught you this? A kid. Yeah. Leo said softly, his attention on Sophie's knee. He tapped it lightly with his knuckle. You feel that? No, Sophie whispered. That's okay, Leo said, completely unfazed. I'll keep asking. He continued the movements, but now he started talking to her. Not about her legs, but about her. What's your favorite color? He asked. Purple, she said softly. Mine's blue, like the sky on a really clear day. You like pancakes or waffles? Pancakes, with chocolate chips. Good choice. David watched, his arms still crossed, but the tightness in his shoulders began to ease a fraction. He saw his daughter, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, starting to engage. She was answering questions, and then she started asking her own. Do you live around here? She asked Leo. Kind of, he said. Do you go to school? I used to. Why not anymore? Leo's hand stilled for just a moment on her ankle. He kept his eyes down. My mom got sick. Then she passed. Been trying to figure things out since. Sophie looked down at her lap. I'm sorry. Leo gave her a small, sad smile. Thanks. David looked away, out across the empty park. The hard shell of his skepticism developed a hairline crack. He saw it now. This wasn't just a boy. This was a boy who had lost everything. Sitting in a cold park, trying to give something to a girl he didn't know. After about 20 minutes, Leo gently tapped Sophie's ankle again. You feel that? Sophie blinked. A little, she said. Like pressure. Leo looked up at David. That's good. David shifted his weight. She says that sometimes in her regular therapy. Yeah, Leo replied. But those sessions are inside a room that smells like medicine, full of big machines that beep. Sometimes kids get scared of the machines. Their whole body gets tight without them even knowing it. He gestured around them, to the oak tree, the gray sky, the open space. But here, there's air. You can hear birds. It feels different. The body can relax. David didn't say anything, but he was listening now, really listening. Leo helped Sophie through a few more simple stretches, show her how to try and wiggle her toes. Nothing dramatic happened, but she didn't look discouraged. She looked focused. As they finished up, Leo stood and brushed off his knees. I can show you again next week, if you want. It takes time. But your muscles, he pointed to her thighs, they still remember how to be strong. You just gotta remind them. Sophie gave a real smile this time, a sight that made David's heart clench. Okay, she said. David cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet. We're not promising anything, he said, his voice firmer than he intended. Leo just nodded. I'm not either. I'm just trying. David stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost against his will, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded $50 bill and held it out. Leo actually took a step back. No, sir, I don't want your money. Jonathan looked genuinely surprised. Then why are you doing this? Leo shrugged, his gaze drifting to Sophie, who was still smiling a little. Because your daughter smiled. David followed his look. Sophie was smiling, a simple, quiet smile that had been absent for months. And in that moment, the crack in David's heart widened into a chasm. He didn't understand. He couldn't comprehend how a boy who had nothing could be so willing to give so much. The following Sunday was a little warmer. Leo was there again, his towel laid out, his supplies ready. This time, when David wheeled Sophie over, there was less tension in the air. David even gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of greeting. Sophie was trying harder now. When Leo asked her to press her heel down, she closed her eyes, her face scrunched up with concentration. Still, nothing happened. It's okay, Leo said. Sometimes it takes your brain a while to find the right path again. It's like a road that's been blocked. You just gotta clear it little by little. David, who had been standing silently behind them, arms crossed against the chill, finally spoke. Why do you do all this? He asked, his voice low. Leo glanced up. I remember what it felt like when my mom helped people. She made them feel like they mattered again, like they weren't broken. I want to do that, too. David nodded slowly. You ever think about doing something else? Something easier? Sometimes, Leo admitted, focusing back on Sophie's ankle. But this feels right. And then something shifted. Sophie's toes wiggled. It was just a tiny, almost spastic movement, but it was undeniable. Her eyes flew open in shock. David knelt down so fast his knees cracked on the frozen ground. Sophie, do that again. She concentrated, her little face turning red with effort. And she did it. Her toes curled, then uncurled. David didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He just knelt there, his hand resting on the footrest of her wheelchair, staring at her feet as if he were witnessing a miracle. And in a way, he was... But the path wasn't straight. The next Sunday, the fourth one, was a bad day. When the SUV pulled up, Sophie wasn't smiling. Her eyes were red-rimmed. David's face was like a thundercloud. She doesn't want to do it today, he said sharply as he lifted her into the chair. Sophie turned her face away, refusing to look at Leo. What happened? Leo asked gently. I tried to move my legs this morning. Sophie burst out, her voice thick with tears. And nothing happened. Nothing. I'm tired of trying. It's pointless. David looked away, his jaw muscle twitching. She's been like this all weekend. Leo nodded. He knelt beside her wheelchair, ignoring her angry posture. You think I never get tired? He asked softly. She didn't answer. You think I didn't sit on a cot in a shelter and cry when my mom was too sick to get up and I didn't know what to do? His voice was steady, but there was a raw honesty in it that made David look back at him. You're allowed to be mad, Sophie. I get mad sometimes, too. But if you stop now, the part of you that wants to walk, it might stop trying, too. Sophie stared hard at the ground, her chin trembling. I don't want you to give up, Leo whispered. Because I haven't. The park was silent, except for the sound of Sophie's sniffles. Then, in a tiny voice, she said, I'm scared. David drew in a sharp breath. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud. Leo leaned in closer. I am, too, he confessed. But being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're close to something big. Really big. Sophie wiped her nose on her sleeve and looked at him. Okay, she whispered. Let's try again. And they did. That day, there were fewer words. Just a quiet, patient work of hands on legs, of heat and pressure and presence. And by the end of the hour, something had settled between them all. It was no longer just a man humoring a strange boy. It was the beginning of a pact, a shared fragile hope, tested by frustration and fortified by a simple, powerful truth. They weren't alone in this anymore. The days that followed the bad Sunday felt different in the Miller household. It was as if the frustration had been a storm that needed to break, and after it passed, the air was clearer. Sophie tried her exercises in the living room with a new determination. David watched, no longer as a skeptical guard, but as a participant, learning the movements Leo had shown him. One evening, as David washed the dinner dishes, he looked over his shoulder at Leo, who was sketching at the kitchen table. Leo, he said, his voice casual but careful, where do you go after this? I mean, after our sessions. Leo kept his eyes on his drawing. Around. David turned off the water and dried his hands, leaning against the counter. He lowered his voice. You got a place to sleep? A real place? Leo's pencil stilled. He hesitated, then said, sometimes. David exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the quiet kitchen. He rubbed the back of his neck. You ever think about coming to stay with us for a while? We got a guest room. It's just sitting there. He rushed on. You wouldn't be in the way. It'd be easier than, well, easier. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You serious? Sure, David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Leo's gaze dropped to his taped-up boot. You sure your neighbors wouldn't mind a kid like me hanging around? David gave a short, genuine laugh. Kid, after what you've done for Sophie, if any of my neighbors have a problem with you, they'll have to answer to me. Leo didn't answer right away, but David could see the fragile hope blooming on his face. The next morning, Leo stood on the front porch of the Miller house, a backpack holding all his worldly possessions slung over one shoulder. David opened the door, holding a mug of coffee. "Right on time," he said, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Sophie peeked from behind him. "Leo," she chirped. He smiled. "Hey, superstar." David stepped aside. "Welcome home." The new routine was quiet but profound. Leo's presence filled the spaces that had been hollowed out by grief and worry. He had his own room, a soft bed, and a small desk for his notebook. He never missed a morning stretch with Sophie, and she was improving. She could move both feet now, making small, deliberate circles with her ankles. It wasn't walking, but it was a language her body was starting to remember. One night, David watched Leo help Sophie with a rubber band exercise at the kitchen table. "Leo," he said, "you ever think about going back to school?" Leo glanced up. "Sometimes." "You're smart," David said. "You could be anything. A doctor, a physical therapist. I want to help people walk again." Leo said simply, "Like my mom did." David nodded. "Then let's figure out how to get you there." They didn't say much more, but the understanding was there. The household was no longer defined by silence, but by the sound of life. Sophie's laughter, the scratch of Leo's pencil, and the quiet, steady work of healing. Meanwhile, a ripple was spreading through Lansing. It started with a nurse from the Children's Medical Center who had seen them at Willow Creek Park. She told a colleague, who mentioned to a parent of another patient. The story of the girl in the wheelchair and the boy with the gym bag was too remarkable to keep quiet. The next Sunday, when David wheeled Sophie into the park, 2 other families were waiting by the big oak tree. One had a boy with a walker, the other a girl whose arm hung limp at her side from a nerve injury. Their parents had heard a rumor, a whisper of hope. Leo looked at David, a question in his eyes. David looked right back. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "This is your time with Sophie." Leo adjusted the strap on his bag. "I want to." He spent that session dividing his time, showing the new parents the simple techniques, talking to their children with the same gentle respect he'd shown Sophie. "You're not broken," he told the boy with the walker. "You're just learning a different way to be strong." Sophie watched, not with jealousy, but with pride. "I like watching him help people," she told her dad on the drive home. David glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't name. "Yeah, it makes me feel like we're part of something good." The following week, 5 families came, then 10. A local pastor brought folding chairs. A diner donated coffee and bagels. Someone put up a flyer, community movement class, Sundays at noon, Willow Creek Park. They didn't use Leo's name, but everyone knew who it was for. A reporter came, and Leo agreed to talk only if the story was about the families, not him. The headline read, "Young Healer Helps Community Find Strength in a City Park." Offers poured in. A doctor offered to mentor him. A nonprofit provided proper mats and equipment. For the first time since his mother died, people saw Leo Cruz not as a pitiful figure, but as someone with a gift. And through it all, he remained the same quiet boy, laying out his towel the same way every Sunday, checking on Sophie first. It had been 9 Sundays. The air was warm, the leaves on the oak tree of vibrant green. A small crowd had gathered, but a hush fell over them as David wheeled Sophie to the center of a large mat. Leo knelt in front of her. His voice was soft, but carried in the quiet park. "Same as we practice," he said. "We help you up. You do the rest." David moved behind her, his hands under her arms. Leo positioned her feet firmly on the ground, his hands steadying her knees. You could have heard a pin drop. "Okay," Leo whispered. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. David lifted. Leo guided. And then Sophie was standing. Her legs trembled violently. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her father's arms, but she was upright, on her own 2 feet. A collective gasp, then silence swept through the park. Sophie opened her eyes, a look of pure wonder on her face. "I'm standing," she breathed. Leo, kneeling before her, blinked back tears. "Yeah," he whispered, "you are." David was frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Slowly, carefully, he loosened his grip. She stayed up. He took one hand away, then the other. She was balancing, all by herself. She's doing it, David stammered, his voice cracking. Leo smiled through his own tears. She's been doing it. Then, because she was 6 and brave and had been waiting for this moment her whole life, Sophie took a wobbling, shuffling step, then another, and a third. Her body wavered, and she fell forward into her father's waiting arms. He caught her, laughing and crying, holding her tight as sobs shook his own body. "You did it," he choked out, burying his face in her hair. "You really did it." Sophie turned her head, her cheek against his shoulder, and looked at Leo. "You said I would." He gave her a teary grin. "I said we'd try." That afternoon, nobody left the park quickly. People stayed, talking, hugging, sharing their own stories of small victories. Leo sat on the bench, watching it all, his expression peaceful. Later that night, in the warm light of the kitchen, Leo was pouring cereal into a bowl. David stood watching him, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You know," David said, his voice rough with emotion, "you changed everything." Leo looked up. "My daughter walked today," David continued, "not because of a $1 million machine or a famous doctor. She walked because a kid with nothing decided to show up, again and again, even when nobody asked him to." Leo nodded. "That's what my mom would have done." David's throat tightened. "I wish you could have seen this." "Seen you?" Leo's gaze was clear and steady. "She did," he said softly. "I think she sees everything." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He walked over and put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Leo," he said, his voice low and full of certainty, "you're going to change a lot of lives." Leo looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no shyness, no hesitation, just a quiet acceptance of his purpose. "I already am," he said. And in the quiet of the kitchen, with the sound of Sophie's soft breathing from the other room, they both knew it was true. The boy with the duct-taped boots had not just helped the girl walk again. He had reminded them all that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from prescription or procedure, but from the stubborn, simple act of showing up with a heart full of hope and hands ready to help. This story reminds us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear duct-taped boots. And healing doesn't always come from a medicine bottle. Sometimes it comes from a heart that understands what it means to be broken and to hope anyway. If this story moved you, don't let the feeling end here. Share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Because you never know whose Willow Creek Park is just waiting for a little bit of hope. Be the ripple